No one dared look Harrison Blackwood in the eye. His rages could shut down entire city blocks. He fired doctors, threatened his lieutenants, and made enemies disappear with a single nod. But at the most powerful gathering of the year, when he collapsed onto the marble floor from a brain hemorrhage, every armed man in the room stood helpless. Then 2 6-year-old black girls, daughters of the poor maid he had treated like a slave, stepped forward. Could a miracle happen in a world built on violence? Harrison Blackwood had not raised his voice yet, and already 3 men at the breakfast table were sweating. He sat at the head of a long mahogany table inside his mansion on the north side of the city, cutting into a steak with surgical precision while his lieutenants delivered their weekly reports. The chandelier above cast golden light across the room, catching the edges of diamond cufflinks and the cold steel of holstered pistols beneath tailored jackets. A man named Donnelly was mid-sentence when Harrison's fork stopped moving. The steak knife hovered above the plate. Donnelly's words dried up in his throat. "Say that number again," Harrison said. His voice was low, almost conversational. Donnelly swallowed. 300,000, sir. The docs came up short by..." The knife buried itself into the table an inch from Donnelly's hand. The mahogany cracked. Nobody at the table flinched, not because they were brave, but because flinching around Harrison Blackwood was worse than bleeding. "Find the money," Harrison said, pulling the knife free, "or I find someone who can." This was the man who controlled the Eastern Seaboard's most feared criminal empire. For 22 years, he had ruled not through loyalty, not through respect, but through the absolute certainty that crossing him meant disappearing. His enemies told stories about his temper, the way people told stories about natural disasters, not with admiration, but with the grim understanding that survival meant staying out of the path. What none of them knew was that Harrison Blackwood was dying. The tumor had been growing for 18 months, buried deep in his brain, where no surgeon dared to reach. It pressed against the parts of him that processed pain, turning ordinary headaches into white-hot episodes that left him gripping the edge of his desk with both hands, jaw-locked, vision blurring. He had fired 3 doctors already, not because they failed to cure him, but because they had seen him weak. And weakness in Harrison's world was a death sentence faster than any bullet. He told no one. He swallowed the pain like poison and let it leak out as rage. The worse the tumor grew, the more dangerous he became, as if his body understood that it was falling apart and decided to burn everything around it before it went dark. Downstairs, beneath the marble floors and Persian rugs beneath the wine cellar and the storage rooms stacked with things no police officer would ever find, there was a basement. It had no windows. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a circle of pale yellow light over 2 small mattresses pushed together on the concrete floor. The walls were bare concrete, and when it rained, water crept in through cracks and pooled in the corners. This was where Rosalie Turner lived with her daughters. Rosalie was 31 years old, though the years in this house had carved lines into her face that belonged to a much older woman. She had come to the Blackwood mansion 2 years ago not by choice, but by arithmetic. Her husband Marcus had borrowed money from the wrong people, Harrison's people, and when Marcus died in a warehouse accident that Rosalie never fully believed was an accident, the debt transferred to her. $68,000. She could work it off, they told her, or she could find out what happened to people who owed Harrison Blackwood money and could not pay. So she cleaned his floors. She ironed his shirts, she served his meals on silver platters and kept her eyes on the ground whenever he walked past. She had buried her husband alone, carried the coffin debt on top of the financial one, and never once let her daughters see her break. She lived by a single rule she repeated to herself every morning like a prayer: keep your head down, keep your girls safe, pay the debt, and disappear. The girls were Zoe and Ruby, 6-year-old twins who had spent most of their conscious lives learning how to be invisible. They knew which floorboards creaked above their heads, which hours the guards patrolled the hallways, and exactly how loud they could whisper before someone upstairs might hear. They had never been to school. They had never seen a playground. Their entire world was a basement, a staircase, and the sliver of sky visible through the ventilation shaft above their beds. Zoe, the older twin by 4 minutes, had never learned to be quiet. She was the one who asked questions, who pressed her ear to the ceiling to listen to the men talking above, who told her mother once that she could feel when someone in the house was angry, "like a hot color behind my eyes," she had explained, tracing a line across her forehead. She watched over Ruby the way a small soldier watches over something precious, always positioning herself between her sister and the door, always sleeping on the side closest to the stairs. Ruby was different. She rarely spoke above a whisper. She was afraid of the dark, afraid of the shouting that sometimes shook dust from the ceiling, afraid of footsteps that came too close to the basement stairs. But Ruby carried something Zoe did not, a warmth in her hands that neither of them fully understood. It showed itself on a Tuesday night in late October, 2 weeks before the gathering, when a sparrow fell through the ventilation shaft and landed on the concrete floor between their mattresses. Its wing was broken, bent at a sharp angle that made Zoe wince. The bird lay on its side chest, heaving one dark eye wild with panic. "It hurts so much," Zoe whispered, pressing her hand to her own chest as if she could feel the fracture inside her own bones. Ruby knelt beside the bird without a word. She cupped her small hands around its trembling body, and the warmth came a soft, steady heat that pulsed from her palms like a second heartbeat. Zoe placed her hand on Ruby's shoulder, and the glow between Ruby's fingers brightened. The broken wing straightened, the tiny bone mended beneath the feathers. The sparrow opened its eye, blinked once, and burst upward through the shaft and into the night. Rosalie stood at the foot of the stairs, watching. Her face showed no surprise. She had seen this before more times than she wanted to count. A bruised knee that healed overnight. A cut on Zoe's arm that closed under Ruby's touch before a scar could form. A stray cat that had dragged itself into the basement with a shattered hind leg and walked out whole the next morning. She did not know what it was or where it came from. She only knew what it meant in a house like this. She knelt in front of her daughters and took their hands, her grip firm enough to make them both look up. "You must never let anyone see this. Do you hear me? Never." Because Rosalie understood something her daughters were too young to grasp in a house full of men who used people as tools, a child who could heal would become the most valuable tool of all. And tools in Harrison Blackwood's world did not get to choose when they were used. Above them, Harrison's empire hummed with violence and ambition. But the most dangerous man in that world was not Harrison himself. It was the man who stood closest to him. Blake Hargrove had served as Harrison's right hand for 11 years, and in all that time he had never once raised his voice. Where Harrison burned, Blake calculated. Where Harrison broke furniture and threatened lives. Blake smiled, nodded, and filed away every weakness he observed. He was the kind of man who could shake your hand at dinner and sign your death warrant before dessert, and you would never see the shift in his expression. Blake knew about the tumor. He had intercepted the medical reports 6 months ago, read them carefully in the privacy of his office, and locked them in a safe that only he could open. He did not tell Harrison. He did not tell anyone. He simply waited the way a patient animal waits beside a river, knowing that sooner or later the current would bring exactly what it needed. The annual gathering was 3 days away, the one night each year when every ally and every rival sat in the same room under Harrison's roof. Blake had already begun making quiet phone calls to key figures in the network. Just checking in, he told them. Just making sure everyone felt comfortable. His voice was warm, reassuring, and completely hollow. The night of the gathering arrived like a storm rolling in off the coast. Harrison's headaches had been worsening for weeks. That morning, he had shattered a bathroom mirror with his fist because the light reflecting off it sent a spike of pain through his skull so severe that he could not see for 30 seconds. He stood over the sink, blood dripping from his knuckles, breathing through his teeth until the world came back into focus. He swallowed 4 pills, straightened his tie, and walked into the grand hall as though nothing had happened. The hall was magnificent vaulted ceilings, Italian marble floors polished to a mirror shine, crystal glasses catching the light of 3 enormous chandeliers. Over 100 men filled the room, representatives of every family and faction in the network. Armed guards lined the walls like statues in expensive suits. The air smelled of aged whiskey, expensive cologne, and the kind of quiet hostility that could turn into gunfire between one breath and the next. Rosalie moved through the crowd, carrying a silver tray of champagne glasses, her eyes fixed on the floor. She wore the same black uniform she always wore, and she navigated between the men the way water moves around stones, never touching, never stopping, never noticed. She passed within 3 feet of Harrison, and as she did, his hand shot out and knocked one of the glasses off her tray. It shattered on the marble. "There's a spot on that glass," Harrison said loud enough for the men nearby to hear. His eyes never left the conversation he was having. Rosalie was not a person to him. She was furniture that had malfunctioned. Rosalie knelt and began picking up the shards with her bare fingers. A thin line of blood opened across her palm. She said nothing. She did not look up. She gathered every piece of broken glass, stood, and walked away with the tray balanced perfectly in her bleeding hand. Not a single person in the room looked at her twice. Downstairs, when she pressed a cloth to the cut and wrapped it tight, her hands were trembling, not from the pain, but from the effort of holding everything inside. Zoe sat cross-legged on the mattress, watching her mother's face with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Mama, that man upstairs, he hurts so bad. I can feel it from down here. Something's cracking inside his head like ice breaking on a river." Rosalie tied the cloth into a knot with her teeth. "He isn't in pain, baby. He is the pain." In the grand hall, the evening was unraveling. A rival boss named Victor Salerno, a heavy man with silver rings on every finger and a reputation for saying exactly the wrong thing at exactly the right time, raised his glass toward Harrison from across the room. "I hear you haven't been feeling well. Blackwood," Salerno called out, his voice cutting through the music and conversation like a blade. "Some of us were starting to wonder if you'd even make it tonight." Laughter rippled through Salerno's corner of the room. The rest went silent. Every eye turned to Harrison. Harrison stood slowly. The headache was blinding now, a white wall of pressure behind his eyes that turned the chandeliers into smears of light, but he forced his shoulders back and pointed a finger across the hall at Salerno. "You want this chair, Victor?" Harrison's voice carried like a gunshot. "Come take it." He took one step forward. Then his left hand went to his temple. His eyes unfocused as if something behind them had snapped. His knees buckled. Harrison Blackwood collapsed face first onto the marble floor in front of every ally and every enemy he had ever made. The room erupted. Guards rushed forward. Men shoved back from tables, reaching for weapons out of instinct. Blake Hargrove was at Harrison's side in 3 seconds, kneeling beside the body, but his hands did not tremble. They moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times. A doctor was pulled from the guest list, a nervous, thin man named Dr. Whitfield, who had been invited as a professional courtesy and had not expected to practice medicine between courses of filet mignon. He knelt beside Harrison, checked his pupils with a penlight, pressed his fingers against the side of Harrison's neck, where a vein throbbed weakly, and felt the erratic rhythm of a heart under siege. Dr. Whitfield looked up at Blake, and every drop of color had drained from his face. "It's a brain hemorrhage. The tumor ruptured." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. 15 minutes, maybe less. There's nothing I can do here." Blake rose to his feet. He turned to the room and raised both hands, his voice steady and commanding, the voice of a man stepping into a role he had been tailoring for himself for years. "Everyone stay calm. We have this under control." But his eyes, for just a fraction of a second, before the mask slid back into place, caught the light of the chandelier, and something flickered in them that was not grief. It was hunger. Deep below the marble floor, Zoe grabbed Ruby's hand so hard her sister flinched. The darkness in his head just broke open. Zoe breathed, her eyes wide and unfocused, as if she were seeing something far away. "Ruby, he's dying. Right now." Ruby pulled her hand free. She pressed her back against the cold basement wall and shook her head, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to go up there. I'm scared, Zoe. Those men have guns. They yell. They'll hurt us." Zoe held her sister's face gently between her hands and looked straight into her eyes. "You don't have to be brave. You just have to hold my hand." Rosalie stood at the bottom of the stairs, and the weight of every choice she had ever made pressed down on her at once. She thought of Marcus, his laugh that filled their tiny apartment, the way he danced with her in the kitchen, and then the phone call, the hospital, the coffin she paid for with money she did not have. She thought of the $68,000 that had turned her from a grieving widow into a servant. She thought of every shattered glass she had picked up with bare hands, every insult swallowed in silence, every night she had bitten her own lip until it bled, so her daughters would not hear her crying through the thin basement walls. Let him die. Let the tumor finish what it started. Let the man who had treated her like property bleed out on his own marble floor, surrounded by men just as cruel as he was. It would not be murder. It would be gravity. It would be the natural consequence of a life built on other people's suffering, and it would be over. But then she looked at her daughters, two small girls standing in a circle of yellow light, holding each other's hands, waiting for her to tell them what was right. Two girls she had taught to share their food with stray cats in the alley. Two girls she had told night after night that being kind was not the same as being weak. If she held them back now, if she taught them that some people were not worth saving, then she would be laying the first brick of the same wall Harrison had built around himself. And her daughters would grow up inside those walls, learning to sort the world into people who deserved help and people who did not. Just like him. Rosalie closed her eyes. When she opened them, the tears were already running down her cheeks. "Go," she whispered. "Both of you. But if anything happens, anything at all, Mama will be right here." She took their hands and walked them up the staircase out of the basement's darkness and into the golden light of the mansion above. From the world where they had been invisible into the world where every man carried a weapon and no one had ever shown them mercy. The grand hall fell silent when the basement door opened. Rosalie stepped through first her black uniform, still carrying the faint smell of cleaning chemicals, the cloth bandage on her palm already spotted with red. Behind her, gripping each other's hands, came Zoe and Ruby, two small figures in worn cotton dresses that had been washed so many times the color had faded to something between gray and nothing at all. Their feet were bare on the cold marble. Every head in the room turned. Dozens of armed men in tailored suits stared at a maid and two children walking across the marble floor toward the body of Harrison Blackwood. A guard named Mercer stepped forward and leveled his pistol at Rosalie's chest. "Get back downstairs, now!" Another guard moved in from the left, blocking the path to Harrison. He looked at the twins the way someone might look at stray animals that had wandered into the wrong building. "Someone get these people out of here." Blake Hargrove straightened up from where he knelt beside Harrison's body. His eyes swept over Rosalie and the girls with an expression that was not anger, but something colder, the look of a man watching an insect crawl across his dinner plate. He had spent 11 years positioning himself for this moment, and the last thing he needed was a distraction from the basement. "Drag them out," Blake said. His voice was flat, efficient. Dr. Whitfield, still kneeling beside Harrison with a stethoscope pressed to his chest, glanced up at the approaching children and shook his head. "This man needs emergency surgery in a hospital that's 30 minutes away, and he has less than 15. Whatever this is, it's a waste of the time he has left." The laughter started from Salerno's side of the room, low, bitter, incredulous. It spread, Men who had been terrified 3 minutes ago were now smirking at the sight of two black girls in faded dresses standing in a room full of crystal and gunmetal, as if they had any right to be there, as if they had anything to offer that all the armed men and a licensed physician did not. Zoe's hand tightened around Ruby's. Ruby was shaking from her shoulders to her bare feet. Then Rosalie did something she had never done in 2 years inside the Blackwood mansion. She stepped forward, placed herself directly between the guns and her daughters, and raised her head. She looked Mercer in the eye, the same guard who had once kicked over her mop bucket for sport. She looked at Blake, who had never spoken a single word to her. That was not an order. She looked at the room full of men who had walked past her 1,000 times without seeing her. "You have all those guns," Rosalie said, and her voice did not waver. "And not one of you can save him. Give me 2 minutes." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mercer's finger stayed on the trigger. Blake's jaw tightened. Then a voice came from the back of the room, old gravelly, belonging to a man named Caruso, who had been in the organization longer than anyone alive. He sat in a leather chair near the wall, watching the scene with half-lidded eyes that had seen everything there was to see in this world and expected nothing from any of it. "Let them try," Caruso said. "The man's dead in 10 minutes anyway. What do we lose?" Blake turned toward Caruso, and for a brief moment the mask cracked a flash of something sharp behind his eyes. But Caruso was Untouchable, a relic from the old guard whose word still carried weight that Blake could not override. Not yet. The guns lowered. The crowd parted. And Rosalie led her daughters across the marble to where Harrison Blackwood lay, with blood pooling beneath his head, his breathing shallow and fading. Zoe knelt first. She placed her small hand on Harrison's forehead, and the moment she made contact, her face twisted not from physical pain, but from the overwhelming sensation of absorbing something vast and dark. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes squeezed shut. She could feel the rupture inside his skull like a river breaking through a dam hot and spreading. "He hurts everywhere," Zoe whispered to Ruby, who was lowering herself to her knees on Harrison's other side. "Not just his head. It's like he's been hurting for years and never told anyone. There's so much anger, Ruby. It's everywhere inside him, packed in tight like it's the only thing holding him together." Ruby looked down at Harrison's face, the hard jaw, the deep lines carved by decades of cruelty, the faint scar above his left eyebrow. This was the man whose voice made her mother flinch. The man whose footsteps above the basement ceiling sent her hiding under her blanket, pressing her face into the mattress so she would not cry out loud. The man who had looked at her mother like she was less than the dirt on his marble floors. Ruby's hands hovered above Harrison's temples. She could feel the warmth building in her palms, ready to flow, waiting for her to decide. She looked up at Zoe, and when she spoke, her voice was barely louder than breathing. But in the silence of that hall, with every man holding his breath, the words carried to the far walls and back. "If we can save him, but we let him die, how are we different from him, Zoe?" Zoe stared at her sister. For all her bravery, for all the times she had positioned herself between Ruby and danger, she had no answer for that. She simply nodded. Ruby placed her hands on Harrison's temples. The warmth came stronger than it had ever been, stronger than the sparrow, stronger than the stray cat with the shattered leg. It poured from Ruby's palms like heat rising from sun-baked asphalt, and where it entered Harrison's skull, something began to shift. Zoe grabbed her sister's wrist, feeding her own energy into the connection, the way she had done in the basement with the bird, and the glow between Ruby's fingers deepened from faint warmth to visible light. Harrison's body convulsed. His back arched off the marble. Blood seeped from his right ear and pooled on the white stone beneath him. Dr. Whitfield lurched forward instinctively, but Rosalie caught his arm and held him back with a grip that surprised them both. The room watched in frozen silence as 2 6-year-old girls pressed their hands against the skull of the most feared man on the eastern seaboard and tried to pull him back from the edge of death. Then the cost began to show. Ruby's nose started bleeding a thin red line that ran over her upper lip and dripped onto Harrison's collar. Her face went pale, then gray, the color draining from her skin like light draining from a window at dusk. Her arms trembled violently. Beside her, Zoe gritted her teeth so hard, a vein stood out on her small neck, and sweat broke across her forehead, running into her eyes. She blinked it away and held on. The crowd shifted. The smirks were gone. What replaced them was something raw, the unease of powerful men watching something happen that none of their money, none of their weapons, and none of their influence could explain or control. Blake saw his window closing. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a cold blade. "This is over. Look at them, they're killing him faster. His body is rejecting whatever this is." He turned to the nearest guards and spoke with the authority of a man who had already decided he was in charge. "Pull the children away. Now." 2 guards moved toward the twins. Rosalie spun around, placing her body between the armed men and her daughters. She was a foot shorter than either guard. She had no weapon. Her hand was still bleeding through the cloth bandage. But she planted her feet on the marble and stared up at them with an expression that made both men stop where they stood. "Touch my children," Rosalie said quietly, "and I swear on my husband's grave you will answer for it." The guards looked at Blake. Blake looked at Caruso. The old man had not moved from his leather chair, but his eyes were fixed on the twins with an expression that might have been the closest thing to wonder he had felt in 30 years. "Sit down, Blake," Caruso said. It was not a suggestion. Blake's hands curled into fists at his sides. He stepped back, but his eyes stayed on the scene, dark, calculating, already rearranging pieces on a board only he could see. On the floor, Ruby was fading. Her hands still pressed against Harrison's temples, but the warmth was flickering, surging, and dimming like a candle in a draft. Her head drooped forward until her chin nearly touched her chest. Zoe was holding her sister upright with one arm and keeping contact with the other, and both girls were trembling so hard the vibration was visible from across the room. Dr. Whitfield checked Harrison's vitals again. He placed the stethoscope against Harrison's chest, moved it, listened, moved it again. Then he sat back on his heels and pulled the earpieces from his ears with the slow, deliberate motion of a man delivering a verdict. "His heart is weakening," the doctor said, directing his words at Blake as if the children were not there. "Brain damage at this point is extensive. There is no realistic chance of recovery." He folded the stethoscope into his jacket pocket. "I'm sorry. He's gone." Blake did not wait a full second. He turned to the room, straightening his jacket, his voice already carrying the tone of succession. "You all heard the doctor. Harrison Blackwood is no." The voice was Ruby's. Small, cracked barely a sound at all, but it cut Blake's sentence in half and left the second part hanging in the air unfinished. Ruby's eyes were red-rimmed and glassy. Blood still ran from her nose in a steady line that she did not bother to wipe. Her arms shook so badly that her fingers slipped twice against Harrison's skin before she steadied them. She looked up at her mother standing behind her, and the expression on her face was not fear anymore. It was something older, something that did not belong on the face of a 6-year-old. "It's not done, Mama," Ruby whispered. Rosalie felt her heart crack down the middle. Every instinct she possessed as a mother screamed at her to pull her daughters away, to carry them back to the basement, to choose their lives over the life of a man who had never once chosen theirs. She reached for Ruby's shoulder. Her fingers touched the fabric of her daughter's dress. "That's enough, baby. You've done enough. Mama is so proud of you, both of you. Let go now." Ruby shook her head, and a single tear cut through the blood on her upper lip. "Not yet." Zoe wrapped both arms around her sister from behind, pressed her forehead against Ruby's back, and closed her eyes. Whatever strength she had left, she pushed through the contact, every ounce holding nothing back. Blake stood with his fists clenched, his empire one heartbeat from materializing. Then Harrison Blackwood's chest rose. It was not a gasp. It was not a spasm. It was a deep, full breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he surfaces from water he was certain would drown him. His fingers twitched against the marble. His eyelids fluttered. The blood beneath his head stopped spreading. Dr. Whitfield lunged for his stethoscope and pressed it to Harrison's chest. His hands were shaking badly enough that he needed 2 attempts to find the heartbeat. He listened for 5 seconds, 10, 15, and then he looked up at the room with an expression that said everything he had learned in medical school had just become insufficient. "His heart is stable," Dr. Whitfield said, his voice hollow. "The hemorrhaging has stopped. I can't explain this." On the marble floor, Ruby's eyes rolled back and she slumped sideways into Zoe's arms. Zoe caught her barely her own strength almost gone, and the 2 of them collapsed together on the cold stone. 2 small girls in faded dresses curled against each other, faces streaked with blood and sweat and tears. Rosalie dropped to her knees and gathered both daughters against her chest. She pressed her lips to Ruby's forehead, then Zoe's, and held them so tightly, her own body shook. The room stood in perfect silence, and not a single man among them had a word. Blake Hargrove remained at the edge of the crowd. His moment had arrived and been stolen by 2 children who should not have existed in any of his calculations. His jaw worked silently. His eyes were empty and black. And on the marble floor, surrounded by the wreckage of his own empire's disbelief, Harrison Blackwood opened his eyes. The first thing Harrison saw was the chandelier 3 tiers of crystal refracting light into 1,000 tiny rainbows across the vaulted ceiling. For a moment he did not know where he was. The marble was cold against his back. His skull felt hollow as if something heavy had been lifted out of it, and the space left behind had not yet figured out what to do with itself. Then the room came into focus, and with it, the faces. Men staring down at him, allies, enemies, soldiers, rivals, every one of them wearing an expression he had never seen directed at him before. It was not fear. It was not respect. It was something closer to awe, and it unsettled him more than any threat ever had. Harrison pushed himself up on one elbow. The headache was gone, not dulled, not managed, not pushed to the back of his skull by 4 pills and sheer willpower gone as if it had never existed. The pressure that had been building behind his eyes for 18 months, the white-hot wire that had wrapped itself tighter around his brain with every passing week, had vanished. He touched his temple and felt nothing but skin and bone. Dr. Whitfield was beside him, stethoscope still in hand, staring at Harrison with the bewildered expression of a man whose instruments were telling him something his mind refused to accept. The doctor opened his mouth, closed it, and simply shook his head. Harrison's gaze swept the room, the overturned chairs, the guards with their weapons half drawn and forgotten the spilled champagne still dripping from a table's edge. Blake Hargrove stood at the edge of the crowd, his face carefully composed, but something behind his eyes had shifted like a door that had been open a crack and was now being pulled shut. Then Harrison looked down. 2 girls lay on the marble beside him. They were small, impossibly small against the vastness of the hall. One of them, the quiet one, lay on her side with blood drying beneath her nose and across her upper lip. Her faded dress was dark with sweat. The other girl held her sister from behind, arms still wrapped around her eyes closed, breathing shallow. Their bare feet were pale against the cold stone. And behind them, kneeling on the floor with her arms around both children, was Rosalie Turner, the maid. The woman whose name he had never bothered to learn, whose face he could not have picked from a crowd whose hand was still wrapped in a blood-stained cloth from the glass he had knocked off her tray earlier that evening. She was holding her daughters the way a person holds something that almost broke. Harrison's first instinct was the one that had governed him for over 2 decades. His jaw tightened. His voice came out rough, defensive, the voice of a man who had built his entire identity on never being vulnerable in front of anyone. "Who gave them permission to touch me?" The words landed in the silent room like stones dropped into still water. A few of the men shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Whitfield looked away, but Rosalie did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. She looked straight at Harrison from where she knelt on the floor, her daughter's limp against her chest, and her expression held nothing. No anger, no fear, no deference. Just the steady gaze of a woman who had already made the hardest decision of her life tonight and had nothing left to lose. Harrison held her stare for 3 seconds, then 5. Then his eyes dropped not to Rosalie, but to the girls. Ruby's hand had slipped from his temple when she collapsed, but it had come to rest against his forearm, her small fingers still curled slightly, as if even unconscious, she had not fully let go. Her palm was warm. He could feel it through the sleeve of his shirt, a faint, steady heat, like the last ember in a fireplace that has burned all night. He stared at that hand. It was small enough to fit inside his palm twice over. The skin was dark against his white cuff. The fingernails were short, unevenly trimmed, cut with whatever Rosalie had available in the basement, probably the same scissors she used to hem their dresses. This was the hand of a child who lived beneath his feet in a room with no windows on a mattress on a concrete floor. A child he had never looked at. A child whose name he did not know. And this hand had saved his life. Not Blake, who had stood beside him for 11 years and spent every one of those years waiting for him to fall. Not Salerno, who had raised a glass and mocked his weakness earlier that night. Not Donnelly or Mercer or any of the men in this room who called him boss and sir and carried guns in his name. Every one of them had watched him bleed on the marble and done nothing or worse, had calculated what his death could give them. Only this child, only her sister. Only their mother, who had every reason in the world to let him die and chose not to. 2 decades of fury pressed down on Harrison Blackwood in that moment. Every fist he had thrown, every life he had ruined, every person he had broken, because breaking people was the only language he knew. The weight of it was enormous. It sat on his chest, heavier than the tumor ever had. He did not cry. His eyes burned, and his jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his neck stood out like cables, but he did not cry. Harrison Blackwood had not cried since he was 9 years old, and he was not going to start on a marble floor in front of witnesses. But the shame was something he could not stop. It rose through him like floodwater, filling the hollow space the tumor had left behind. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Harrison Blackwood did not have the rage to drown it out. He looked up at Blake. The room was still silent. Blake stood 15 feet away, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression arranged into something that was supposed to look like concern. But Harrison had spent 2 decades reading men the way a predator reads the movement of prey, and what he saw in Blake's face was not concern. It was the barely concealed frustration of a man whose carefully built plan had just collapsed. "I know what you were waiting for, Blake," Harrison said. His voice was quiet, not the controlled quiet of a threat, but the exhausted quiet of a man seeing something clearly for the first time. Blake's composure cracked for half a second. It was enough. Every man in the room saw it, and the room's gravity shifted back to Harrison without a single order being given. Blake said nothing. He took 1 step back, then another, and disappeared into the crowd. It was the last time anyone in that room would look at him as a man with power. Harrison turned to Rosalie. Getting to his feet took effort. His body was weak, his legs unsteady, and he had to press one hand against the floor to push himself upright. He stood in front of her, and for the first time in the 2 years she had worked in his house, he did not look down at her. He looked across eye to eye as if seeing a person standing where he had only ever seen furniture. "The debt is done," Harrison said. "You're free, all 3 of you." Rosalie rose to her feet, her daughters still leaning against her legs. She met his gaze without gratitude, without relief, without any of the things a man like Harrison might have expected from someone he had just released. "I don't need you to forgive a debt," Rosalie said. "I need you to change." The words hit Harrison harder than any blow he had taken in his life. He had no answer for them. He had spent his entire adult life in a world where every interaction was a transaction power. Given power, taken debts, collected threats, delivered. No one had ever asked him to simply be different. He did not know what to do with the request. He gave a single nod. It was small, almost imperceptible, but the weight behind it was heavier than any oath he had ever sworn. Then he looked down at the twins. Ruby was stirring now, her eyes half open, unfocused. Zoe still held her sister, watching Harrison with those sharp, knowing eyes, the same eyes that had seen through walls and felt the pain of strangers since before she could read. Harrison lowered himself to one knee. His kneecap hit the marble with a sound that echoed through the hall, the first time any man present had ever seen Harrison Blackwood kneel before anyone. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. He did not know how to speak to children. He had never spoken softly in his life. Zoe looked at him and tilted her head the way she did when she was listening to something only she could hear. "You don't have to say anything," Zoe said. "The darkness in your head, it's quieter now." Harrison swallowed. He looked at the small face in front of him, then at Ruby, then at Rosalie's bleeding hand, and the hollow place inside his chest ached with something that was not pain. He stood. He turned away and walked toward the corridor that led to the private wing of the mansion. Before he crossed the threshold into the darkness of the hallway, he stopped. He did not turn around. "Clear a room upstairs for the three of them," Harrison said to no one in particular and everyone at once. "The basement is not a place for people." Then he walked into the dark and the grand hall erupted into whispers behind him. The next morning, the mansion was quiet in a way it had never been before, not the silence of fear, but the stillness that follows a storm when the air is clean and everything feels fragile and new. Rosalie held Zoe's hand in her right and Ruby's in her left as they climbed the main staircase together. It was the first time they had walked those steps as anything other than servants, the first time they moved upward without carrying trays or mops or keeping their eyes on the ground. Ruby's steps were slow, she was still weak, still pale, but she held her sister's hand and kept moving. At the top of the stairs, sunlight poured through a floor-to-ceiling window that faced east. It flooded the landing in warm gold, the kind of light that the basement had never seen, not once in 2 years. Ruby stopped. She stood in the light and looked out the window at the city below the rooftops, the tiny cars, the distant river catching the morning sun. Zoe stepped up beside her and looked out too. "See?" she said softly. "From up here, everything looks so small." Ruby smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since the night before, and it was small and tired and real. Below them, at the foot of the staircase, Harrison Blackwood stood alone. He watched the three of them standing in the light at the top of his stairs. He did not smile, but he did not turn away. The most powerful man on the eastern seaboard stood in the shadow of his own mansion, looking up at a maid and 2 children bathed in morning sunlight, and he felt the unfamiliar weight of something he could not buy, could not threaten, and could not control. It was the beginning of change, not a transformation, not a redemption, but a crack in the wall. And sometimes a crack is all the light needs.